Dr. Tanveer Ahmed is a psychiatrist and author. He's the author of a recently published book, Fragile Nation, which you can buy here at the back of the hall. He's a local government representative and has sat on multiple boards, including the Australian Medical Association, the Advertising Standards Board, and the Australian Multicultural Council. He has involvement in the media and has presented international news stories and co-hosted a game show. He was chosen by a PM's committee as one of 100 future leaders of Australia. He came to this area after being forced out of White Ribbon for expressing his views about domestic violence. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Tanveer Ahmed.
No, thanks very much to Mike, and thanks to all of you. Lovely to meet some of you last night for our Polynesian feast, and it's great that Paul and the team could organise this meeting to happen in Australia, and I hope you enjoy your time here. Gold Coast is affectionately known to a lot of Australians as Bris Vegas, because it's one of the oldest casinos in the country, so I encourage you to visit. I was there with some friends last night. Now, it's great to share company with certainly one of my idols, Bettina. I think she's gone off to a media event, but she really outlined some of the challenges here. And I'm really someone who's, I guess, fallen into the space without barely knowing kind of it existed in a major form. I honestly had not heard of a men's rights activist probably just 2.5 years ago, before what happened to me around White Ribbon. And I remember when it did happen, and I'll give you a bit more background in it. So essentially, I often write columns for the newspapers. The gender area is not necessarily something I would necessarily write about. I'd certainly write about health, ethnic affairs, say Islamic issues, this kind of stuff, religion. And I remember really just essentially expressing, I would call them almost casual observations of patients of mine, particularly men, and some of their experiences both around, say, domestic violence and to some extent suicide. And its overlaps with social factors, be it unemployment, be it migration, drug and alcohol use, mental health. Exactly what Bettina was alluding to in the morning, that it had all these other complex arrays beyond just gender. And merely expressing that view invited such a powerful response. And you can imagine, most people will be well aware of what the kind of response it may get. And in turn, a kind of a concerted social media campaign about the fact that I was a White Ribbon ambassador. And I guess it really opened my eyes to this space. I go, what is going on? And again, as someone who'd written about religion and other issues where very heated emotions and touching on issues around the sacred, right? So someone who's written about that and knowing that applying reasoned debate around issues where there's deeply held beliefs, not necessarily tied to reason, that's when I couldn't help but be very interested in this space. So you don't get those total responses if you write about the train timetables, for example, or kind of fisheries management. Those sort of responses only come if there are some deeply held sacred beliefs, and they're very tightly held. And as Cassie learnt in Australia, that certainly issues around Rosie Batty, etc., that's held in a sacred way and invites certain reactions. So this is partly what we're dealing with in these sort of issues. So really, I've come to this issue from treating patients. Be they in traditional settings like my practice or in hospital, but particularly with men, often not in traditional settings. Be they in the criminal justice system, for example, workplace evaluations, insurance company concerns. Now, we heard from Bettina early this morning. Men's health and men's issues often have potential allies. Well, she'll talk about it more in these other groups, employers groups, insurance companies who have a strong financial interest in better dealing with men's related issues like suicide. And really what this has shown me is that men are obviously, part of the issue around suicide, and I'll go into a bit more depth around some of the, the technical and sort of physiological and the health-related issues, is men are far less likely to present. They're more likely to engage in violent methods. Their duration of any disorder is shorter. They're also, all of those things make them more likely to commit suicide. And we know some of the figures. They're 3 times more likely in Australia, even more in certain age groups. So this is really a heightened issue. But what it's really shown me is that often our systems are just not set up for those sort of, for help to be provided. Be it phone counselling, for example, which has traditionally been gender neutral, but that usually favours females. And a host of other arenas where help seeking in a male setting, this is a high-risk group, utterly a high-risk group. And in any other field, there would be very special considerations. Just as all our systems have particular pressures or particular policy settings that we must include, say, a diversity setting or one for Indigenous. In so many health settings where clearly men have a much higher risk, there's none of those settings. So this is something that became very clear when I started looking into this issue. Now, another area that I got interested in this sort of issue is I found myself having several patients. One of my first jobs after a consultant, I was actually working attached to an eating disorders unit. And I'm not an eating disorder specialist, but I'd often find myself kind of covering and helping out there. And I found myself getting quite a few men with eating disorders patients. And I looked into this, and I actually did a newspaper-related story around it. This really opened my eyes to another trend where this was a disorder that had quadrupled in recent decades, probably since the 70s. There was virtually no specific services for them. Most of them were desperately fearful around the stigma to even seek help. There was very little research or scientific basis around it. And look, some of that is understandable because it's a new area. But I found it a very interesting area to highlight all these issues around this process of gender transition that we're going in, how there's many people, many of you and many of my patients who are struggling with that gender transition, how many of our systems don't help or foster at all the people who are suffering through that gender transition. And I think it was a very, very interesting health disorder to highlight so many issues going around in masculinity and men's health. Now, many men, as Bettina was alluding to too, many men are coping just fine through this period, I should add. I look at many of my social group who are educated and have access to the bonanza opportunities in a metropolis like Sydney, particularly for the educated and the wealthy, etc. They have great choice in careers and identities. Their partners are often as accomplished as they are, often more so, and the reality is they're often getting lots of help in providing. They don't have to engage in national service, and I don't hear anybody complaining about that. Although having said that, just a kind of a side point, I think as a doctor, something I see, and I've long had an interest in, say, anthropology as well, I think one of the issues going on with boys is a lack of initiation rituals from adolescent to adulthood. And so that's an interesting one to think of. And interesting, if you think of self-harm, the rise in self-harm in recent decades, and it's one of the few areas we have definitive evidence, there's a broader sense that mental health disorders have increased, and I'll touch on that. Self-harm is one of the few that we can absolutely say for sure has increased. And while there's a host of hypotheses, particularly in adolescence, you think of how many traditional cultures have some type of kind of a controlled self-harm aspect to initiation. So it is almost a kind of Western modern version of a crying out for initiation ritual. It's something to ponder anyway. So I guess a key point I want to make here, we're here talking about gender, but I think it's to make our case as strongly as possible, I think we have to be wary about being too gendered about some of these discussions, because there's also a great overlap with other factors, most notably class. Now, this was feminism and the left's big mistake in recent years, that they focused too much on minority groups, gender, sexuality, and shifted to the concerns of the professional managerial class, forgetting their historical base. So there's no question, yes, the critics of many of us in this room will say, oh, well, you're a bunch of losers, blah, blah, blah. But the way to think of it is there are these structural disadvantages for men. Unsurprisingly, it's going to affect those without resources, be it education, financial, social, emotional. It's going to affect those groups the most. So it's not a surprise that they may be disproportionately affected. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's still not, has a strong focus or overlaps with gender. And I'll just tell you, just very recently, I had one of my patients was a surgeon. And I guess like many of us who've come to this space, relatively recently, would never have considered this an issue. And he's had a major divorce, he's going through the family court, he's been super successful, super talented, and really within that, he was still able to be, I think, from the history I've taken, a pretty good dad. But he's really seeing it front up. He's seeing it right, and he, often our sessions are about that. He's like, I can't believe that things could be like this. It makes no sense to him that what he would have considered as a kind of a just society, overseen by kind of expert professionals, that something often based on what seems like myth, if you like, straight out myths, can be propagated. So I guess that I tell you his story because it's a great story of someone professional, educated, middle class, who would not have held these views, but is now opening his eyes about it. And they're the people you and I need to recruit, to build up this issue. Now, my talk will compass a little bit by what we mean by mental health and its relation to men, masculinity, and social policy. Now, suicide doesn't always require a mental illness. Now, there are times like when we're facing, a painful, prolonged death, for example, it can be considered rational. For men in particular, it's often associated with limited warning, no past presentation to services, and a short duration of any diagnosable disorder. Now look, a good side one here, only a month ago, and those of you who are local will know this, a colleague of mine, a gastroenterologist in Brisbane, killed himself. I think it was in his late 40s, early 50s. Dr. Andrew Bryant. It was received national attention that someone with seemingly no problems, highly educated, with a lovely wife and family, could commit suicide. But interesting, the discussion at no stage focused on gender. It focused initially largely on profession. So there was all these debates about the problems being a doctor and do things need to change, which is reasonable. Doctors do have a high risk, and it's partly about having access to means. In the same way, people from rural areas also have a high risk because it's partly to do with access to means. They're far more likely to have access to guns. But it was an interesting example of a man who had killed himself, but there was very little discussion of the fact that he was a man. Now, we can't look past the stats. Obviously 3 times more common than women, more violent, more impulsive, and commonly associated with drug and alcohol use. 6 men kill themselves a day, and 2 women, I might add. While loss and emotional pain will always be part of our lives, and as will thoughts of suicide, there is surely more we can do with males in particular. Currently, the advice seems to be along the lines, and it was illustrated in a recent ABC documentary last year. It was called Man Up, and it was great. I think there was a lot of hope that this was potentially a real kind of breakthrough in building up a bit of a shift in some of the views around this debate. And I think in many respects it was still useful. But the broad point across in that was, men just need to have a good cry. That was almost the kind of limited kind of view of the documentary. Now, yes, I'm probably mischaracterising it a little. They certainly made efforts. But I still think that's often the message. And what that really tells us is men are the problem. It's not that men have problems, that they are the problem. So this is a broader cultural script, if you like, that we very much need to challenge. It'd be similar to, say, telling female domestic violence sufferers, well, why don't you just leave the relationship? So it'd be a very similar, it's a similar sort of message, and nobody would tolerate that in a domestic violence framework. Now, I just want to talk a little bit about just what we even mean by mental health, because it does actually overlap significant. It obviously overlaps significantly with this issue, but it actually overlaps more broadly about the wider debate you're having. So really mental health we can think of as three different topics. So one, neuroscience, so this idea that we're made of essentially physiological beings, that we're chemicals and hormones, and part of mental health are deficiencies in that. Or if not just deficiencies, the chemical signature of distress we feel is part of the way we classify mental health concerns. Hence, we can use tablets, etc. And that also has overlaps with gender as well. So, for example, be it testosterone. Dopamine is a critical one. It can affect impulsivity, your capacity around rewards, punishments, and in turn addiction, impulsive or risk-taking behaviour. So that's an example where men are actually have greater risks of dopamine-induced disorder. So there's a biological example that can affect men disproportionately. Another aspect of mental health is behaviourism. And this is really about rewards, punishments. Pavlov's dogs, many of you will remember that. So that's what most psychologists do. And I know there are many of you working in that field in the audience today. And that's really about, say, negative thoughts lead to negative emotions. And by challenging those thoughts, we can improve mental health. Now, that broader psychological realm obviously then overlaps closely with personality, self-image, and that certainly overlaps with broader cultural currents about masculinity. The greater idea that men are there to protect and provide, they can't necessarily show their problems, that their jobs are to sacrifice for society or in the public realm, and their space is the public realm. And as part of that, the private personal realm is diminished or has been downplayed, and I'll talk a bit more about that. So that's another critical aspect of what we call mental health. And then the final aspect of mental health, well, not necessarily the final, but I guess another discipline that is part of what we call mental health is psychoanalysis. And that's really, we bearded Teutonic elders, that's the image we'd get, namely Freud, and I know there's a few Germans in the audience. That is actually very important to this issue we're talking about. And the deeper meaning of psychoanalysis is that there are instincts and drives, we're primitive beings, and there's something called society, right? And societies here, we're kind of playing out a role. Meanwhile, we're these instinctual primitive animals, and we're kind of trying to manage and kind of regulate that. And a lot of distress is about the challenge of regulating all that in this kind of artificial social setting that we live in. Now, psychoanalysis is actually very important to what we're talking about here. At a deeper level, the power of psychoanalysis was the sudden emphasis on the private personal realm and the notion of individual desire, of psychological desire. And the movements from the 60s actually grabbed onto. If you can think of the intellectual impetus of a lot of the movements around feminism and post-60s, there were kind of this amalgamation of some psychoanalytic themes about desire and the private personal realm and Marx. It was a kind of a funny fusion of those two elements. But what feminism did, it prioritised the desire of the private personal realm of women, racial groups, minority groups, etc., at the expense of men, particularly the white male, but men more broadly. So this has great overlaps. And this is really one of the biggest insights that Warren Farrell came up with in his myth of male power. Rather than focusing on this idea of female powerlessness in the public realm, he shifted the focus to going, actually, there's a male powerlessness in the private realm. So that's really one of his biggest insights and very original. But what feminism did is they kind of, it's a corruption of Freudian ideas, of psychoanalytic ideas. At a deeper level of psychoanalysis, still that we have an autonomous self. So much of what we feel has a deeper link with our self-image, our personality, and lots of biology. What feminism and a lot of those movements did was go, actually, if I feel distress, the fault is out there. The fault's out there, i.e. in the structures of society. And someone who hadn't necessarily looked at ideas around patriarchy and stuff, when I read about it, the scientific formulation of patriarchy is so flimsy. It's extraordinary that it can take on, so much power over recent decades. But it actually does, it grabs onto bits of psychoanalysis, this idea of the unconscious, but applies them at a social level. It's an unconscious social phenomena. So it's another corruption of ideas from psychoanalysis, which is why it's so important. And then obviously the social realm is obviously a critical part of suicide, and this is where many social theories come from. So probably the most famous is the sociologist Durkheim, and many of you will be familiar with. His idea was anomie, that we have, when we're essentially alienated from broader society, we don't have connections. And again, this has close overlaps to men. We heard a little bit, again, from Bettina talking about men increasingly have less shrinking leisure time. I had to do a radio interview, and the topic was why men have no friends. And these studies have come out in recent decades, where increasingly we're closer to our partners than ever. So we have partners, equal, as I said, equally, if not more accomplished than us. So if we're more and more dependent on our partners, but particularly as we hit our 30s, 40s and 50s, and you'll find suicide really peaks in those decades of the 40s and 50s, it appears that our social circles really diminish. And there's a range of factors there. But I think that's a big part of some of the debates we're having around this issue. Now, I argue in my book, Fragile Nation, and one of the key reasons for the cultural rise in mental health across Western societies is that life's project has shifted to one of individual self-fulfillment. Now, that can put more pressure on all of us to fine-tune our psychological well-being. Now, that's a broad cultural trend that affects us, all of us, male or female, but it certainly has ramifications about suicide. So when people feel their lives don't necessarily fit their perceptions of what it means to be fulfilled, they're more likely to feel that their life no longer has meaning. And some of the other things I talk about there, half a century ago, we had characters. So kind of had a moral dimension that were good or bad, and now we have personalities. And personalities sort of have a different connotation. It's more about self-presentation in how we appear to the outside world. There's also a decline in collective connections, be it unions, political. Half of us in this room, barely 20, 30 years ago, would have been part of a union, maybe a political party, a community organisation. Most of us are not. So obviously this is a collective group right now. So partly compensating for some of those links in part. But again, often men are less involved in these types of settings. Again, highlighting when things do go wrong in their life, be it work, relationship, they have fewer, they have much lesser kind of a social cushion, if you like. Now then obviously we've talked about these broader political movements around identity politics, which really targeted men in the public realm, but enforced a undermining of the male private realm. And this is, I think, one of the big issues in male suicide. We're essentially going through a period of gender transition, and it's happening quite quickly, but that broader focus on the male private realm still has a lot of work to do. Now, we saw in Cassie's interview with Erin Pitsey how feminism came out of movements against capitalism. It was sort of a counterweight to what was seen as the male harshness of the market economy. And it's terms like sort of toxic masculinity, stigmatization of the male brute. They all have their kind of origins there. Political correctness also has its origins from that period. It was kind of seen as necessary to clean up problematic views around race, misogyny, and homophobia. But derivations of this worldview include, say, the globalist outlook that sees a lot of the population as kind of backward and scorns the local or the provincial. Now, this is the legacy. Now, I mean, all of these trends, go to the heart of, Trump's election, for example. But this is a legacy of gendered prejudice that leads to movements to feminise more and more of our occupational and public spaces. Now, this is where it's links with Marx. It's another version of human perfectibility, that our world would be innately better if we were all just that little bit more feminine. So that's a kind of bigger undercurrent of some of these trends, if you like. I guess that's another warning I would give to some of you, that in some ways co-opting some of those aspects has strengths. The reality is we've lived at a time where those rules of identity politics, i.e. victimhood, elevation of pain to acquire status in the public realm, these are the way you got to fight these political battles. And we heard from Karen, you've got to have that emotional argument. But I guess I'd just say there's limits to that as well. Now, just more fundamentally about men, my friend Glenn Poole, which many of you will know, wrote a book on male suicide, has been closely involved in the issue in Britain, has recently moved to Australia, and he really nuts down some of the key issues that may cause men to kill themselves. That cause it work, wife, mood, booze, right? So that's and we can think of wife broadly there, but essentially work, the critical one, where a man is 40 times more likely to kill themselves compared to an employed female, and something like 6 times more compared to an unemployed female. So it shows you some of the much greater identity and expectations around men having work. And this is a great area. This is absolutely a classic area where we see kind of a lip service given to ideas around male suicide. So we should get involved, we should do more about it. It's terrible. It's a terrible thing. They need to get help. Meanwhile, we'll enforce gender quotas in jobs that are utterly focused on blue-collar males or the working class males, the groups that are the most affected or have the most potential. They've been the most affected by broader economic changes in our society, be it automation, outsourcing overseas, as well as they've been the groups least likely to manage the gender transition taking place. And then you go, we'll actually make it harder for you to get a job as well. So that is I think that's a great example of where we pay lip service to some of these issues and enforce a kind of a global idea of entrenched female disadvantage, completely ignoring class or other issues. It's a travesty, really. In South Australia, it's happening by stealth in a lot of areas. Certainly in some major organisations, they'll have bonuses linked to managers, depending on a certain number of promotion of females. Okay, we can debate that. I'm not convinced about that either. So now you hear stories of a female being promoted and them not even having a team. So it's just in name only. So they'll have some sort of management role, and it's basically so other managers can get their bonuses. Now, many of the men there won't be quite as affected because they have all these other resources, they have education, etc. But you put a similar thing at a different level, and it's a very different ballgame. In South Australia last year, they brought in a 50% gender quota into the police forces there. So there were literally, I've spoken to people involved in that. There were literally women just being pulled, borderline pulled off the street, like with a very moderate interest, 0 qualifications, and they would get the job above a motivated man who might have had some qualifications. They might not have been the best candidates, sure, but this is really what we're dealing with. And South Australia is one of the most economically troubled parts of the country, with a declining manufacturing base, a large number of uneducated males, a great example of how systems are badly disadvantaging males. So let's go through the other areas. So relationship, we've thought about these bigger trends, about men having shrinking leisure time, increasingly being disconnected from their networks, and then imagine what happens then when you get the divorce or something along those lines, and then there's a custody battle. Then suicide becomes a solution to a problem when you no longer seem to have the resources to fix the problems in front of you. So that's another example where some of the systems in place do contribute to the potential for male suicide. And a very good proportion, especially particularly men in their 40s and 50s, there's a very good chance that the people who attempt to commit suicide then will be involved in some sort of custody dispute. And, you know, I'm sure some of you will be familiar to some of those trends. So there's another example. So we go through work, wife, then mood. And this overlaps directly with my arena, where men are far more likely to communicate distress in different ways, and many of our even diagnostic systems don't necessarily recognise it. They're far more likely to be irritable. They're far more likely to act out in some form, say through aggression. They're more likely to self-medicate with substances. They're more likely to just basically withdraw. I mean, that would happen in women too, in adolescents. But they're less likely to express their distress in the categories that we design for mental disorders. So this is another area that they're disadvantaged. And I guess the booze bit, again, men are more likely to use substances, and that presents a major risk. A lot of suicide attempts will happen around the impulsivity and poor judgment that may happen around substance abuse. So that's a great example. But for men, often mental health is about dealing with the private personal realm and then thinking about how that plays out externally. Whereas for men, often it works the other way around. In terms of what I've found is more effective, is beginning from the outside, sort of going, okay, let's work on, trying to sort out your job problems. Let's try and help you get appropriate legal help for this issue, be it a charge, be it a family dispute. Then going into their actions, and then looking at their internal state. So often it's a very different way of approaching some of the problems, rather than kind of, tell me about your feelings. That sort of style of engaging men doesn't necessarily work. And so it's not a surprise that many would not present. I mean, there's been quite a bit of research, phone lines, and I think Australia is getting better at this. For example, Lifeline is beginning to look at, okay, how do we engage men better when we're talking to them on the phone? Yes, they've seen that they're far less likely they spend less time on the phone, they're less likely to call. Oh, okay, almost out of time. So it is beginning to happen. I think we are seeing trends. But the hardest part, as you all know, you'll get pronouncements, but when it comes to actually getting money or getting legal changes, getting the real kind of hard nuts of change, that's much tougher. But that's where the real action is. All right, we're almost out of time, so I would like some time for questions. So, just these broader social issues. Men are far more likely to have substance abuse disorders, alcohol, more likely to be victims of violence, usually male, but also female, almost 10 times more likely to suicide if unemployed, more likely to be imprisoned, homeless, poorly educated, and at much bigger risk if separated, and much less likely to access mental health services. As I said, most services are gender neutral, yet males should be considered high risk. That's just not the case. And men are also, I think one of the Australia's great contributions to this space was the Men Shed movement. And what that shows is a great example of men are far more likely to deal with their problems through tasks and shoulder to shoulder, which is an excellent principle around sort of male mental health. So we're going through a period of rapid gender transition. Now, the negatives are disproportionately affecting men, particularly in the lower education and socioeconomic ranks. Many of the men's issues we are talking about are about such men when faced with structures in legal, health, employment, or other administrative systems that have historically seen all males as innately advantaged. Yet our statistics drastically refute, and they're being unduly penalised. Now, I encourage you to fight, but also ask you to be a little wary of mirroring the strategies and resentment-based movements like modern radical feminism. Oh, we're almost out of time. Now, I'd love some time for questions. Again, I'm new to this space, and the more time I spend it, the more passionate I'm getting about it. And there are clearly issues here. I think there's a bit of a groundswell, and some of the broader political disruption we're seeing around the world, I think is a potential ally. There's, right around I think, particularly in the media we talk about, I think there is a very gentle sense that if they don't engage these voices, they may get wiped out themselves. So we're seeing that a little bit, not huge amounts, a little bit. But I guess the point being is that the seeds of change are there, and it's time to push harder. Thank you. I'll take some questions.
Tanveer, you've made a very cogent case about the problem. We're in an age where we talk about primary health care. I'd like you to comment on the funding priorities of federal and state governments faced with this versus their funding priorities of other conditions that pose a threat to people's lives.
Now, this is where it's just glaringly obvious. Like, there's no coordinated strategy around men's suicide. We don't have a national strategy for it, yet we absolutely, should have. Just during the week before I came here, I got an email from a man at a university saying, I can't find any detailed research locally about misandry, for example. There's such a dearth of a kind of an institutional, scientific or research base, and that is really one of the big gaps. So you come to this area and it feels bare sometimes. The advocacy there, I think, look, often these things begins initially with these, you feel like sprouts are arising, where there's more of a voice around it, and that's where it begins, and before you can hit the actual, research, etc. I agree with Bettina, there's so many professional areas that do seem captured. And again, I don't work, formally in research areas or funding bodies, but all we can do is really fight, particularly in whatever our immediate space is. That's the bit you've got to fight gently with data, using some emotion, but consistently with data, like a battering ram. And I think that is what's happening, where there's all these institutional sacred structures, but increasingly the data is being presented, and increasingly there'll be more and more people who may have held... White Ribbon's a good example, where there's many men there that would have just grabbed onto the feminist ideas thinking it was gospel, and they think it was a good idea. Yet most of them, highly sensible, intelligent, and want to do good. But many of them, when you present them the data, you'll get them scratching their heads. Not all of them, but certainly some of them. But that's what we have to do in every space, be it legal, be it health, be it education, for example. I have two daughters, and I do find it extraordinary, at least, it's just anecdotal, but within our friend group, just about all the kids and it's a highly educated group, all the kids that are struggling are boys. They end up diagnosed with ADHD, they end up getting all these extra assessments, and, off the top of my head, I could name, 5 or 6 of our sort of kids' friends. Yet, most of the girls are thriving. So that tells you something. It's hard not to scratch your head and think, okay, there's something amiss systemically there.
Am I on? Oh, thank you. My name is Ray Bonnie. I'm a very passionate mental health advocate that works predominantly in male-dominated workplaces, giving men permission that it really is okay to not be okay. I'm also a very proud honorary member of the Monash Men's Shed that's in Victoria. And did anyone know that there's more men's shed outlets than McDonald's outlets here? There you go. But how many do we actually really know about? And my question for everyone is, if there are so many of these outlets, why are they so hidden in shame? And why? What is the stigma around men's sheds? Are they really a danger to our community, or are they saving men's lives?
Look, I guess I certainly have personal experience. I'm actually, through my local government work, I'm on our local committee for the men's shed. And certainly our local men's shed is an outrageous success. Like, it's gone through the roof, and they're always demanding more resources, more space, and we're always in kind of fights with them to try and work out how we can accommodate their rapid rise. So certainly there's no, locally at least, I get a sense of a real need being filled there. I know, again, I think it's partly around just broader male behaviour and the cultural script, I think. Because I often have patients go, why don't you go to your men's shed? And I'll give them all the details and stuff. I have to keep battering them with it before they end up there. So part of it is to do with help-seeking behaviour and the messages they get.
But I think that message that's still going through is that so many men's sheds don't get off the ground because they're too close to a primary school, or they're too close, to somewhere where the men are going to go and hurt the people in the community. And that's a lot of the stuff that we're seeing, which I find not only outrageous, but just I feel so ashamed that we're not. This is one outlet that men have for support. There's no shelters, so here's a men's shed movement that is really got great integrity and great support. However, we are still hiding it so deeply in shame because of this stigma that we have that all men are dangerous.
Look, it's a great Australian success story. So to be honest, it should be framed as a huge success. Like, I haven't seen that personally. But our men's shed is a roaring success.
Oh, mine is as well. I love mine.
But so I haven't necessarily seen all that negative stigma, but no doubt it exists. But I think all the data around men's shed, all the personal experience is off the chart positive. So again, we've just got to keep pushing the data.
Keep promoting it, and thank you. I won't take any more time.
No, my pleasure.
Yes. Tanveer, I've just in regards to your insight into the White Ribbon, you're down here, mate.
Oh, yes,
the White Ribbon campaign and the way it's infiltrated the school system here in Australia, particularly in New South Wales. Perhaps I was just asking your opinion on the ways to opposing that, and perhaps I can tie that into the impact, mental health impact on both boys and girls. And the anecdotal evidence I would share with you is in the public school system, in the high schools, where there's posters up in the foyers of the schools promoting the White Ribbon campaign, where there's teachers that are wearing white ribbons nearly all year round as a little badge. And then at the actual time of, in November, I believe, they have the White Ribbon Day, where they're separating the children, and they're getting boys to sign a pledge. This is what they do in the workplace with men. Now, I'm assuming with men you have a choice whether you sign this pledge or not, but they're getting boys, 9-year-old boys, to sign a pledge, which is effectively apologising for being male. They're having girls go to another room where they're told about the ideology of White Ribbon. So my question is, how do we oppose that? Because from a parent's point of view, that's not what I want for my
parents,
children.
Yeah, you're right
that's
on there.
That's not what I want for my children.
Most parents do not want that. So you touched on it right there, and you'll find even when those things happen and parents learnt what happened, many were angry. Yes. I mean, that's the thing with the White Ribbon's packaging. Again, I got involved. Realistically, I think White Ribbon has the potential to be a great promoter of modern masculinity. This is how we can be strong, sensitive men, etc. But then its packaging is that, right? But then underneath is all these sets of ideas. So most of those boys would not have a clue about, and nor should they, about what patriarchy or privilege means. And they'll think, oh yeah, we shouldn't hit our girlfriends, sisters, and it's very easy. The wrapping of White Ribbon is very easy to sell. Right, but underneath is a dangerous, faulty product. That's what we're dealing with. But parents, like Bettina was talking about, kids in the domestic violence debate, parents are the critical one in those ones, and many parents do speak up. And I know Miranda Devine and others wrote about it. So they're the allies to engage. Mums, not even just parents, mums. They don't want that. They don't want their boys to hear that.
I'm just going to have a quick word. About 5 years ago, I was sitting in my lounge room thinking about how I was going to commit suicide, and I wouldn't have called a helpline. I wouldn't have gone to my GP. The only thing that stopped me was the masculine pattern that I didn't want to make my family suffer. So I think we do have to recognise that masculinity can be good, and there is healthy masculinity, not just bad masculinity.
No, thank you so much for sharing it. I missed your name, sorry. What was your name?
Andrew.
Andrew. Now, Andrew, thank you so much for sharing that. And really, I think it's very representative, your story. So, I mean, I guess what you ultimately said saved you. What you highlight is that just every bloke who commits suicide will also have a plan for life. They'll have it, right? So often our job in services, be it friends, be it the health services, be it work colleagues, is to expose that plan for life and make it accessible and make it achievable. And 9 times out of 10 it is. But that's often the challenge in this space, where that plan for life becomes inaccessible, it becomes clouded with a host of things, and there are periods where the act is impulsive, more violent, and that's the thing with suicide. But it was a beautiful story, and I thank you for sharing it. Now, I apologise, I'm going to have to run it and catch a plane. I encourage you to many of the things I was talking about are in my book, Fragile Nation. I apologise that I won't get to sign it for you, but I encourage some of you to get it and read it, and I very much encourage you to continue the fight. It's a critical fight, and that's a great way to finish. These are the people you're trying to help, people like Andrew. Thank you very much.